They were putting people's lives in danger. The risk was immense, and we had to do something to stop it.
My mum was, she was funny. She loved me kids and my dad. And she was just a fun-loving mum.
In later life, Janet Westhead developed Alzheimer's and in February 2017 suffered a mini stroke. She was admitted to Blackpool Victoria Hospital's stroke unit. Initially, she seemed to be recovering well.
She was talking to the lady across the bed, having a laugh and a joke. She had movement in her left side and it was coming back, so she was quite happy with that.
But as Janet remained in hospital, her family noticed worrying changes.
Well, I wondered why my mum was so anxious and screaming and seeing things that she shouldn't have been, like the devil and spiders crawling up the wall, and I was very concerned about this, and I asked what they had given her to make her like that, which I've got replied, Zopiclone.
Zopiclone is a sleeping pill used for short-term treatment of insomnia. Susan was worried what impact it might have on her mother's dementia.
Because my mum had Alzheimer's, I sat up all night looking at what Zopiclone can do to her. So I sat there and wrote a letter to the trust regarding why my mother was given Zopiclone. I was very concerned about the way they were treating her, what they were giving her, and how much she had deteriorated in a few weeks. I wasn't getting any answers. Who prescribed these drugs to my mum?
When Janet was discharged in May 2017, she was so frail she had to be cared for in a nursing home. She died 7 months later, aged 80. The following year, a student nurse was put on shift with a senior staff nurse, Catherine Hudson, who was responsible for the running of the stroke unit.
Her colleagues described her as being a confident, competent nurse, a big character, somebody who would like to get her own way.
But what the student nurse witnessed concerned her.
They were doing their nighttime medication rounds, and they were with one particular patient who had suffered a stroke. At that point, she produced a Zopiclone tablet out of her uniform pocket. She then went on to give the tablet to the patient. The student nurse knew this was wrong and asked her why she was doing that when it was not prescribed. Catherine Hudson replied to say that, well, really, you don't need to worry about it. She's not for resuscitation, this patient, and if she were to die, there'd be no post-mortem.
This alarming response wasn't the only red flag about Catherine Hudson's behaviour.
The student nurse heard her speak about withholding medication from patients, particularly laxatives. And the reason for that was so that she didn't have to clean up after them during the shift.
Alarmed at what she saw, the student nurse turned whistleblower, and DCI Riley and her team were alerted.
Catherine Hudson was arrested the following morning before she was able to go to work, and we conducted a search at her home address, recovering drugs that we believed were stolen from the hospital and a number of items, including her mobile phone.
When officers reviewed text messages found on the phone, they were stunned. The messages suggested Catherine Hudson had been routinely sedating patients simply to control their behaviour.
there was a whole raft of messages that had been exchanged between Catherine Hudson and other members of nursing staff on the stroke unit who she worked with, and these went back many, many years.
DCI Riley and her team realised they had to move fast to prevent patients being given drugs they hadn't been prescribed.
It was clear that the view of the patients and the contempt that Catherine Hudson had for her patients was shared wider than just herself. The types of messages she was sending and receiving were in respect of patients, not calling them by their names, often using bed numbers or derogatory nicknames, and speaking of them in quite despicable terms. They were really upsetting to read.
And the evidence suggested that Catherine Hudson was receiving support from a colleague.
Charlotte Wilmot at the time, she was a nursing practitioner and worked on the stroke unit. There was evidence that Charlotte Wilmot was actively encouraging Catherine Hudson to unlawfully sedate patients. She was arrested.
Investigators then had to establish if the patients mentioned in the text had suffered.
To help us to do that, we needed to seize the medical notes from the hospital relating to those patients, and each one of those medical notes was reviewed to look for any evidence of unexpected drowsiness, patients that couldn't be roused, were there any patterns of behaviour after the shifts that Catherine Hudson and Charlotte Wilmot had worked that were particularly of interest to the inquiry. Most of these patients had sadly died since the investigation had begun, so not only were these families grieving for their loved ones that they'd lost, we were then visiting them to tell them that we suspected your loved one might have been a victim of ill treatment and may have been drugged whilst they were on the stroke unit.
Susan Miller was contacted about her mum Janet.
When I spoke to the police, I told them about what had happened to my mum, what drugs they were given to her, what they had done to her. My mum wasn't my mum anymore. She was this poor old woman that had to go in a nursing home because she couldn't look after herself anymore.
During the 5-year investigation, police reviewed the care of more than 100 patients. Most of their families told detectives that they suspected something was amiss with their loved one's treatment.
Some of the patients had told families that they were being drugged, and when families had spoken to the nursing staff about this, they were reassured that clearly that wasn't the case and that actually they were confused. And as anyone would, they trusted what they were being told by the nursing staff.
In October 2023, Catherine Hudson was found guilty of 3 counts of ill treatment and 1 count of conspiracy to ill treat. Charlotte Wilmot was found guilty of conspiracy to ill treat and encouraging Hudson to sedate a patient. Hudson was sentenced to 7 years and 2 months in prison, and Wilmot sentenced to 3 years.
Catherine Hudson would take some degree of delight in seeing patients suffer. To do that, in my mind, is truly evil.
I cannot believe that them and any other person could treat people like this, you know, inhumane. It was just horrible what they'd done. It breaks my heart.